Hello, everybody. Welcome on in. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. We're going to wait just a minute to let everybody trickle into the room for our webinar today, where we're going to talk about process over output using FeedbackFruits to measure learning. As we wait to get things started off, I would love to hear from the group we have today, what institution you're from, where you're calling in from, to see kind of that global representation that we usually have on these different events. So let us know. Right now, I'm here in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, here where it is 6 p.m. And with me, I've got Robert Hammond calling in from Florida. Where exactly in Florida, Rob?
I'm in Tampa.
Tampa. Okay,
Yeah,
lovely.
Tampa.
Anyone else from Florida out here with us in the crowd? Feel free to let us know in the chat. And we'll wait just one more minute to get things kicked off. Nice, we
Tampa
got
that feels like it's been summer for 3 months already.
That's good. That's one of the things that we miss over here in the Netherlands. We're waiting for those first days of sun, but this year it's been amazing springtime. A lot of sun.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of rain like usual. Well, we got people from all over. We've got Canada, we've got from Bhutan, we've got Netherlands, Utrecht, we've got New
Germany, there you go.
Hampshire, we
Cologne,
got
nice.
Portugal, got a team from the UK, we've got some early morning people joining us in California. Lovely. Thank you so much, guys. Well, with that, I think we're going to go
Puerto Rico,
ahead
there we go.
and kick things off. So, welcome today, where we're going to talk about, well, how we can look at student learning in a different way rather than the more traditional way of assessing students based on artifacts, on output and deliverables that they create. We're going to focus on how we can evaluate the learning process and encouraging students to reflect and actually be the driver of their own learning process. So today I'm joined by Robert Hammond. Before that, my name is Cole Groom. I'm product marketing manager here at FeedbackFruits. I've been working in educational technology since I was even a student in university, being involved with different ed tech firms, working with Instructure, Canvas, and then for the last 3 years here at FeedbackFruits, where I work very closely with our partners to kind of identify the different ways that they're using our product and finding these success stories like what we're going to share with what Rob has done with FeedbackFruits and his courses later on in our webinar today. But Rob, could you give a brief introduction of yourself for the
Yeah,
crowd?
sure. Sure, thrilled. Wonderful opportunity to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to share. I think we're facing a really important pivot, and I think we're all very aware of that. And I'm really happy to share perhaps a way for us to be able to manage through some of this and do it at scale. So I'm at University of South Florida. I'm an instructor at the University of South Florida. I'm also responsible for the sales program here, so all the curriculum around the sales program. I run a center, the Center for Marketing and Sales Innovation. And I also teach in our doctorate program and master's programs.
Lovely. Well, what we're going to do is kind of go through just the high level overview of what we're going to cover during this session today. We're going to start, of course, just by introducing the problem. What are some of the trends that are going on in higher education that is causing us to need to look at this shift of no longer looking just only at the output when we assess students, but looking at the process and then looking at, well, as you assess the process, why is this a more beneficial way to look at student learning and how can we use feedback to drive that process? We're, of course, going to bring in some practical strategies, some ideas from research around different pedagogical approaches, but then we're going to share how Rob has approached this in his own courses and some specific use cases on how we can actually apply this idea of process-based learning into a course design, even sharing some template assignments with you. And then we'll wrap it up just with a few key takeaways and, of course, having time for Q&A. We're going to have a few different moments of interaction throughout the webinar. So you might see some polls coming up on your screen, but also feel free to jump in the chat with any questions that you might have. Very happy to answer those along as we go. We have Ava with us here today, who's going to be monitoring all the questions and sharing different resources in the chat as we're going along. And so part of the reason of why we are kind of going into this topic today is how we shift into the idea of what is 21st century education, especially in the context of higher education, where if we look more traditionally, where going to university, going to college, it was about receiving this diploma, right? That was your proof of knowledge. And that was really all you needed as you went out into the workforce to show, hey, I am a capable person to go out into the workforce. But now what we're seeing these trends in the corporate fields and different working environments that employers care more about the skills that students have, not just the certifications that they've received. They want to see this proof of learning. They want to see what are the exact skills that you've developed throughout your educational experience, and the importance of having a bachelor's degree is going down because employers are looking more at skills. And so that is where, as a higher education institution, we have this opportunity because students are developing these skills, but we want to make sure that it's very explicit how we were approaching that skill development with students, but also making sure that it's something that they are able to communicate and demonstrate as they go out into the workforce in their future. So really focusing on these 21st century skills or durable skills. There's a lot of different ways that you can call these, but making sure that students have these different attributes that are going to help them to succeed in their future careers. And so part of what makes this even more important and even more urgent, I would say, is just the all the different AI tools that students have access to. This is a slide I put together just with a few of the tools that came off the top of my mind and ones that we've heard that are being used by students frequently. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's way more tools that students now have access to, which are actually going to be able to help them to complete their coursework. Some of my favorites are listed here, but Rob, is there any other AI tools that you've either heard from students or that you use yourself that you
Yeah,
like to talk
there's
about?
yeah, I think we just had a conference last week actually where we it was the Academics Meet Practice conference. And so what we did was we used a particular element here where we had demonstrated for the folks Gamma, Notebook LM, and HeyGen. And so just kind of like, hey, this is what the front looks like. And we actually teach those three in our capstone marketing class. We actually highlight those and help folks with them. And then we also used a new company out there. It's a company called Copient.ai that does sales training with a generative AI avatar. And the technology's gotten good enough now that you can stream the avatar in real time. And so that's a big change because a year ago you really had to use something like Synthesa and render the avatar, kind of a couple hours processing thing. Now it's generative, right? And it just every day it gets better. I was watching a podcast or listening to a podcast the other day, and I think large language model is kind of down to 400 meg now. That shows up on a phone these days. Like that's crazy that we can get that kind of fidelity out of those kinds of systems. But my research favorite, by the way, Research Rabbit's a great one. I like Undermined. So to
Okay.
give one for the researchers out there, that's a really good one, I think, for doing academic research. It's really
Yeah.
geared at that space.
Exactly. It's great to always hear what tools other people are using because of course you're only exposed to the ones that you happen to stumble upon.
Right.
But there's so many good tools out there that have their own speciality. Like yes, you can use ChatGPT for everything, but if you use it a lot, you start to realize like, there's a lot of places where it's really falling short and not actually helping you to do what you need to do. But so for all of us in our own usage of AI, but in the context of students, what this really shows just by putting all these different tools on the screen here is that students have the capability to generate almost any different kind of deliverables that you might make for your class, whether it's an essay, whether it's a video, whether it's an app, whether it's coding. Students have tools that they can use to assist them. And what we're seeing from surveys with students is that they are using them. So regardless of your AI policy, which of course is good to set, I think we need to approach things in more of a way of embracing AI rather than thinking that we're able to limit it and that we can tell students not to use it. And that is what we're going to talk about today is how can we start to design assignments and look at how we assess students in their process of learning so that whether they use or don't use AI is not really part of the equation.
Yeah, and one thing that's also kind of interesting, Cole, on that one is I teach a course. It's called Marketing Technologies and AI. And last fall, we were teaching the course, and maybe half the class was using AI and understood. So I kind of had to teach prompting. I had to teach the tools and kind of the basics of it, right? This spring in my advanced professional sales class that I taught, I had an assignment where we were doing something in class. Every student pulled out their phone, took a picture of the assignment, and took care of it and using the premium version of ChatGPT. So just in the 4 months or so from the assignment in the fall, two different classes, but the same students, right?
Yeah.
To give you an idea of how quickly it moved, and they were all premium subscribers because they wanted to be able to do it on their phone.
Yeah.
And so, just really it's dramatic how quickly it has moved the goalpost, so to speak, of how do we assess learning.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that highlights especially that finding a temporary solution will never be the answer. These things are going to continue to change semester to semester, and we want to design assessment and assignments in a way that are future proof. Even as students are using these different technologies and new technologies come out even more, hopefully those assignments that we can design now will still be durable and be able to be used for semesters to come. But what we wanted to do was to hear a little bit from you in the audience, just about what is your perspective on how students are utilizing AI, and specifically, do you think that it is helping them or that it might be taking away from their learning experience? So really curious to hear some of your opinions on this one. I mean, Rob, I think we know your stance that it's something that can really help the students, but I mean, any devil's advocate side of the argument here?
Yeah, I think, there are two different ways of looking at this world, and, it has a lot to do with your perspective. I think back when I first graduated, or when I first went to school, programmable calculators first came on the scene. My undergrad's engineering, and so I was in those courses, or high school perhaps even, and there was the one professor who said, you're going to learn how to interpolate logarithms because, well, that's how I learned how to do it, and you never know, your battery might die on your calculator. What are you going to do then? Sounds familiar with, well, what are you going to do when AI isn't there? And then I had other professors that said, you're an idiot if you don't go buy this calculator at the bookstore. And by the way, if your battery goes dead, you're going to wait to do it until you get home and change the batteries, right? Because it's just that much better and that much easier to do. AI is that now for this generation of student. It's not coming out. It's not going away. We aren't going to be able to control it. So we need to recognize that there are skills that are going to atrophy, and we need to figure out how do we make sure that we're building assignments that teach those skills that we were counting on before, recognizing that the process is just foundationally different than what it was. And it is a watershed moment.
Yeah, exactly. So Ava, you can probably go ahead and close that poll for us and we take a look at the results. But let's see. Wow, pretty split between the group of those on the side of producing better work and it reducing engagement and critical thinking. I absolutely see the argument for that, but then that is also where, as educators, in the way that we build assignments, that we can potentially instruct and guide students on how they can use AI so that it's not taking away from that engagement and critical thinking.
I would argue both of those statements are true and accurate
Yep.
at the same time.
Yep.
So how do we get critical thinking and better work?
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. Well, that's part of what we might look at a bit in your assignments, but
Yeah,
I guess yours is less
I
about
hope so.
generating
That's
AI
the goal.
content. Um, we'll go into it a bit more, but essentially one way to think about it is, well, how can we shift in the way that we evaluate learning? And this kind of image that you have here shows the scales of how we are maybe allowing or having students use AI in their completion of assignments. So is it no AI at all? Is it just using it to help them edit and improve their work? Or are they just generating it mindlessly using AI and then copy pasting and submitting it to get feedback? That is where you'll definitely be seeing more of this reduction in engagement and this reduction of this critical thinking and learning. Or if we can get students to really reflect and think about the quality of work that AI is generating, that's where we can start to introduce some more of these critical thinking aspects into the way that they're using it for their work. ultimately, what the goal needs to be is that we are helping students to develop the skills that they need, these skills that are going to be useful for them as they go out into their future careers and into the workforce. So some of these that are very commonly highlighted are things like critical thinking, collaboration, adaptability, being able to self-regulate, solving problems, and being creative, which working with AI in a particular way can even help you to develop some of these skills. But I know this is really something that you preach, Rob. So kind of what is your perspective on the ways that we bring this focus onto skill development into assessment design?
Yeah, I think, this isn't new. If I were to take the same list of skills for when I started university, 40 years ago, I think we would have had the same, more than 40 years, I guess now. But anyway, I think we would have said the same thing, right? That we want our students to have critical thinking skills. We want to be able to collaborate. We want to be able to adapt to changes that are happening in the world. We want to be, self-regulation and reflection. We want, problem solving, creativity, right? Those are all things that we certainly would want to have, in our students. And the difference is that the landscape has changed. And so therefore we need to think about the pedagogy changing at the same time. But the goal, I don't think, has really changed. And the assignments need to change when the landscapes change. And I think that's the point of where we're at today and in today's conversation.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that you mentioned kind of the pedagogical side of things because that's actually what we're going to go into next for a moment. If anybody was with us on our webinar that we did last month with Claudia and with Natalie, we focused on project-based learning and then this other approach from Claudia and the team at EDEC Business School in France about this approach they take, which they call the applied soft skills pedagogy. And so essentially, this is where they bring this teaching approach that has a specific focus on the skill development of their students in the business program. So these are just some of the key components of how they approach this pedagogy and implementing it into their teaching practices, where they're making sure that they bring real world application to their assignment design. They make sure that feedback drives the learning process and also the experiential side of things is driving the student learning process, where they're also making sure that students are developing communication, they're working together in teams, and that they're understanding how they can start to develop themselves as leaders. They really built this approach in Kolb's learning cycle, ultimately with the goal of bringing people together for preparing for their professional success. And so one of the ways that they do this is just one of the examples of how they apply this feedback-driven approach into their assignment design, was where in one of their courses, students had to do a leadership and coaching assignment. So what they would have the students do is actually engage with the assignment before they had any theoretical input. They would sit by themselves and record a practice coaching session by themselves before they received any of the theory. Then they would reflect on that. Then they would go to class and actually get that theoretical input. They would learn about the topic that they'd done the assignment on. Then after the class, they would do the assignment again, but with one of their peers, and as well as self-reflecting, also get peer feedback on their assignment. And so it helps to show students where they were at before they received that input of the class material, what was their understanding of the topic, teaching them something along the way, and then saying, how are they able to adapt? What changes are they going to make now that they have first reflected on their own understanding and received new information? Then they get to work together in teams with their peers to actually be able to make those adjustments, make those changes, and being able to show that clear learning that takes place over time. And so this is what makes it experiential and also iterative, which we're going to see through some of the assignments in Rob's courses as well. If you're interested in learning more about this applied soft skills pedagogy, we actually have pedagogy guides on our website, from 20 of the most commonly used pedagogical approaches in higher education. And so Ava will drop the link in the chat for anybody that wants to check that out, but these are totally free online that you can go and take a look at to learn a little bit more about this teaching approach and some learning templates applied to it as well. And so as we shift into this discussion, moving a bit more away from AI, but into the importance of feedback and how can we use feedback as this mechanism to help develop students through their learning process, be curious to hear from the group that we have with us here today. What are some of the ways, like what is the mechanism that you feel that feedback has the biggest impact on the way that students learn? So we can launch that poll. Be curious to hear some of your thoughts from your approach, Rob. What would you say is kind of your perspective on this question?
I think, you know, when we start talking about feedback, and we're going to get to this when we get to the assignment, but how do you do it at scale is my question, right? It's a I can certainly know how to do feedback in a one-on-one environment, and you know, we do a lot of that, especially those of us, you know, that have spent some time in practice prior, you know, to education. Do a lot of that type of coaching and teaching in that kind of environment, but that's different when you've got class sizes that are, you know, 50 students or something along those lines. So even in that pedagogy example that you gave, where you're reinforcing the emotional skills, each one of those becomes another assignment, right? And that gets really challenging to try to deliver when you've got, you know, 4 or 5 sections maybe that you're teaching, or 3 at least, right? And you've got 50 students in them, and now I'm going to blow those out and I'm going to look at each one of those pieces as being feedback. And let's face it, students do work that's assignments, not works that's good for them. So, you know, how do you do that at scale, I think becomes a really significant challenge.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the challenges that many institutions are facing now, just as class sizes start to grow, budgets are starting to be tight. It's not this easy to add new faculty to the roster while we are seeing this bounce back in enrollment. So it becomes a challenge that even for courses that maybe didn't used to have such high teacher to student ratios, that these are starting to increase. So finding those ways that you can improve that quality while making it scalable is definitely one of the bigger challenges that institutions and educators are facing now. Ava, I think you can go ahead and end that poll and we'll take a look at what were some of the results from the group. So the majority actually focusing on this timely, informative feedback throughout the learning process. That I think is a very clear way of how it helps, but I think it doesn't address kind of your mention here, Rob. That's one of the most difficult to scale approaches of
Yeah,
the ones below, right?
like always, right?
Yeah.
You know, I would we always have a limited on resources, right? And so how do you use resources in the most intelligent way at the point of influence? I think we all knew just intuitively, you know, that timely formative feedback during the process, it's always better, right? You know, you have the confounding aspects of what happens when you give feedback at the end, right? Nobody remembers what happened along the way. And
Yeah.
so how are you engaging at that point of inference? Like at that moment where a decision is made, how do you do that, right? And I think that's a really tough thing to do, and especially to do that in a world where we have multiple classes that are online or hybrid, right? You know, student learning occurs at the point of when they are engaging, which is not at 9 a.m. or 4 p.m. or during the workday or Monday to Friday. You know, it's sitting on their bed at 11:30 at night with an assignment due at midnight, right? Like, let's be clear. Like, how is that happening? And so how do you do that? How are you available? How are you there to provide that feedback at, like I said, that point of inference?
Yep.
That's a tough
Exactly.
problem at scale.
Exactly. And so just to kind of wrap up this section of our webinar today, wanted to put a nice bow on things with some practical strategies of how could you start to make this shift towards process-based evaluation in a scalable way. One of the main ways that we see is through relying on peer feedback, putting students in the driver's seat and making sure that they are the ones who are actually assessing each other. That is a way that you can increase the volume of feedback that the students are receiving without being entirely dependent on an individual faculty member or teaching assistants. I think another great way to do so is getting students to reflect, right? Making them the driver of their own feedback. And we're about to see a really good example of how you can put even more emphasis on this in the way that Rob has designed the assignments for his course, but also making them iterative. So through things like self-assessment, peer feedback, and then ultimately teacher feedback, giving students those opportunities in between to iterate and improve, this is where you see the learning taking place. This is where you're able to measure that change through the process. Another way that this can also be done is looking at a group more holistically of the work that a student produces rather than just individual artifacts one at a time. So looking more at portfolio-based assessment, making this even more concrete. This is another slide from Claudia at the EDEC Business School in France, where she made this comparison kind of how would you think about this in the traditional way, and then what are some of the ways that we can take a more skill related approach to these different types of assignments. So shifting from one-time submissions to using peer feedback and allowing students to iterate on their deliverables, using feedback as a multi-source rather than only summative at the end, making sure that we move to more real-world applications in our assignments rather than only on theoretical discussions. Or when you're assessing students, looking more at the process and the behavior than only at the final product, kind of the main thing that we're looking to talk about today. And then ultimately, not just looking at how students understand content, but looking at how they understand the skills that they were supposed to develop throughout their different assessments. And so before we go into look at some of these examples and how they've been applied in Rob's course, we've got kind of our last poll for this part of the presentation of the group of us today. How do you feel where you're at your institution, or maybe even in your own courses if you're teaching? Is this an approach that you already see either in yourself or in your colleague faculty members, or just at your institution? Rob, at USF, is this something that you see more widely adopted, or is this a movement that you're trying to create and grow and spread throughout your department and maybe even to other departments?
Definitely an it depends answer,
Mm,
right? It depends a lot on the perspective of the instructor, right? And the size of the class, honestly, right? It is just a tremendous amount of work to be able to provide feedback, iterative feedback in the process. And when you have these large section classes, maybe a couple hundred students or something like that, how do you actually engage with them, right? And you can't provide that kind of feedback. And yet, even we may have skills that are, or classes that are particularly skill driven, as opposed to knowledge driven. There's certain classes that are just knowledge driven. I get that, right? Maybe you can assess that. But if I look back on some of my early, academic or university experiences, it was show your work, right? Was the kind of assessment to it. And then we got technology for things like Scantrons and, fill in the bubbles and, completing assignments in that form and multiple choice tests. And now it was what the answer was as opposed to what the process was.
yeah,
And there's an underlying assumption in that I don't think is valid, that learning occurred. And so it'll be interesting to, kind of share that perspective of it. But yeah, there's, people whose view is that they're just trying to, get through, and this is their assignment, this teaching assignment, and I'm going to get done with it and do it in the minimum way. Then yeah, I think they're still relying on these kind of scantrons and large section classes
yeah,
and grading outputs, as opposed to really engaging with students and ensuring that knowledge has occurred, or
yeah.
skill development.
No, it's definitely important to highlight that in some disciplines and some different course setups, that it's much easier to begin to make that transition than in others. But really good to see from the audience that we have with us, like over 40% already taking some focus on the process-based assessments, and nearly another 30% working on starting to implement that. So that kind of reinforces this idea of this is the trend that is taking place, and people are starting to see this and to make those changes. But with that, Rob, I want to hand it over to you to just talk a little bit about kind of how you implement this process-based learning approach in your courses.
Yeah. So let me first step back and say, we do this in multiple classes. The specific example that I'm going to give you today is around sales role plays and in sales courses. So at the University of South Florida, we have a vibrant sales program. And so this would be, it's kind of odd. Not all universities actually have a degree in sales. There'll be a marketing degree or something like that, but we don't have a major, but we have a minor. And then we have a concentration in the marketing major for sales as well. And those include several classes that make up that particular degree focus. And so one of the key elements of, I think, any sales education, whether this be in practice or it be in the classroom, is this idea about doing role plays. And in a role play, typically what you have is you have a case of some kind that's been written up around a particular scenario where it's either an industry or a role or an industry and role combination and some scenario or some event that's happening. And you'll actually have some universities that will host in-house or travel to intercollegiate competitions. We actually host one of the largest intercollegiate competitions in the country. We actually call it Selling with the Bulls. So it's kind of fun, a little play on words with that one. But what you end up with is you have these different events and there's a rubric associated with it. And you've got the rubric is based upon some sales theory or sales engagement approach. So a typical one people may be familiar with would be something like the spin selling, like spin selling from Neil Rackman, where it's situation, problem, implication, need, payoff is the acronym for spin. And so that's instantiated inside of the rubric. And so in the classroom, you would talk, that would be your theory, as it were, right? Is this methodology for how you're going to do it. And you would talk about how you discover information, how do you engage with individuals, how do you handle objections, and then how do you quantify benefits? And you'd go through all of those kinds of things. And then the practical test is, can you put those skills on the floor, so to speak, right? Can you actually conduct a role play? And so there's different ways that that's done. So sometimes that is a faculty person is in the classroom and during class, they're doing role plays with the students and they're actually grading them in real time. Other times, some faculty may bring in outside business partners and have them come into a room and conduct the role play and give feedback to the student as a practitioner, being a largely vocational kind of driven skill set. Other times, people may record them, right? So they record those role plays and then package those up and then review them later and grade them on their performance. So there's some particular problems around how you do that. One of which is that these are high stakes for the students. And you all know that high stakes skills development and skills development don't go hand in hand, right? We need to try things when the stakes are not high. So giving someone a brand new skill and then saying, I'm going to grade you on the delivery of that skill is the least productive way to actually learning the skill. Right? It has the least amount of transfer, least amount of risk taking. It's just not a good model. And so we have to kind of think about how do you best go about doing that process. And these commonly you're going to have 2, 3, 4, maybe even more of these role plays in a semester. Classes that other classes that might do this would be something like in a negotiations class would have a lot of these kinds of experiences as well.
Yeah. Also things like psychology and medical, I know they do
Sure,
a reliance on
sure.
quite some role plays as
Yeah.
well. But
So
with those
a pretty
different
common,
scenarios you mentioned, it's hard to manage at scale once the class sizes go up, right?
yeah. So let's just take for a moment, if we've got, pick a number, 50, just make the math easy, right? Let's say you have 50 students in your course and you've got in your section, the class you're teaching, right? And you're going to do this, let's just say once, just one time. And you're going to have a role play that's going to take 10 minutes, maybe 15. But at 10 minutes, that's 500 minutes of video, right? So before you type the first key to give feedback, you have over 8 hours of videos to watch. You do that 3 times, you've spent an entire day of your life doing nothing more than just watching videos before you type the first word of feedback, and likely feedback that a student is actually not going to engage with. Because they already got their grade. So it would only be the most motivated students that are actually going to read that feedback and reflect on it, as opposed to look at their grade and either complain or think, I got through that and move on, right? So this is the problem that we had and why we really approached a different way of thinking about how to do the role playing and how to actually go about doing these assessments. And so that's where we kind of drove first. And I would say that we had the manual process, so to speak, of doing the feedback and approaching that. And we'll talk about that from a pedagogy perspective. And then the automation side or the mechanization part of that, they were able to embrace with the FeedbackFruits program. And so, or software and algorithms. So it's kind of those two pieces of it, right? The tool itself mechanizes the process, but the process is still the pedagogy. It's still the teaching process. And yes, we can do that in a more manual way. It's just a lot harder to do.
Yeah. So what we've done is kind of for this role play approach, we've highlighted, well, what are the 3 key challenges? And then what are some of the ways that you've addressed them kind of in your assignment design? So first one kind of being separating knowledge and skills assessment.
Yeah, I tend to think of this as almost like an XY chart, right? Like you've got on one level, we have knowledge attainment and knowledge validation. On the other side, you have skills development, right? And those aren't the same thing. And I think we too often conflate the two and don't really rationalize or develop a pedagogy or understand what the goal of our assignment is. Is it actually the knowledge development component of it? And how are we assessing that? And then how are we thinking about it actually being able to have that skill in a demonstrable way so that when you go into the market, when you're from an employability perspective, that we've actually delivered a student to your earlier point, Cole, where we're talking about these durable skills, like being able to demonstrate the ability to have this, take that knowledge and put it on the floor, right? As an example, right? I think that's a critical point of how we think about these assignments and what we have to do. So kind of restructured this process. So again, the normal way of doing this, or normal way, a common way of doing it, I guess I would say, is someone's grading this role play and they're giving this feedback, right? So it's high stakes, single point of feedback, and it's really not temporal in the sense that you're going through the whole interaction and you get a result at the end. Well, which part of it was actually influencing the outcome? And you really don't know that unless you're breaking that down and looking at it in individual components. If you're giving that feedback in a classroom setting and you're just using your feedback, you have a primacy and a recency bias like anybody else does, and it creates a real problem for us. So what we've done in our pieces of it is we break that thing apart. And so the student themselves, we don't grade their performance on the role play. It's a completion grade. You have to do it, right? We give them points for it. Otherwise, I don't know, somebody might not actually do the role play, but we give them points for doing just the role play. But we grade the quality of their self-assessment. Right. So, and that self-assessment is based upon a rubric that we provided them that they have to go out and fill out and give a score. And then follow on with that then is they have to provide a timestamp, an example, and a recommendation for improvement across that rubric, across all those different elements. And essentially what those timestamps and those examples and the quotes are speed bumps. It forces that student into watching their own video 4, 5, 6 times. That's the learning moment. That's when the actual knowledge is adopted and is actually, instantiated for the person. Because absent that, and, I think we've all had the experience of watching our own videos, right? It's
That's
too easy
exactly what
just
I
to
was just
ignore
gonna
them.
say. Yeah.
Yeah. No one likes to watch their videos. Like, I don't like editing my own stuff. I don't like my mouth speak. I don't like the way I stand and look sometimes, or that funny, weird face that I make and I scrunch up my nose, right? Nobody likes that. But every time I've done media training in my practice career, the hallmark of every one of those experiences has been video and self-reflection. So taking that in and recognizing it's a high stakes skill development becomes really important. And so actually what we'll do in the rest of that assignment is the knowledge portion is a test. And essentially it's the detailed outline for the role play that includes the math, the quantitative benefits, or whatever is critical in that particular theory that we're deploying or that we were communicating, that we want them to view as a lens to evaluate the case and the material for. It also is a preparatory function to make sure that when they walk into the role play, they've done at least a little bit of work.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. No, very cool way of shifting kind of not the burden, but the moment of learning onto the students to regulate it themselves rather than only receiving feedback and hoping for them to
Right,
incorporate
right.
it. And for our next challenge, we already alluded to it a little bit, but it's how can you do this at scale when things can take so long and grading can be so cumbersome?
Yeah. And oh, by the way, watching videos, like, watching 8 hours of video, I made that mistake the first semester I taught, right? So 8 years ago, I kind of entered the classroom after a long practitioner career, and I did it like everybody else. Well, I didn't realize that it was a smaller school that most of these people were doing this with. And my section was 50 students. And after you're watching like the 40th video, they all have the same problem. They all have the same challenges, essentially. So how do you actually, be there at that moment when they're going through that experience, right? How do you actually produce that content to them? And so this idea of how do we apply, shifting that part of it, my evaluation now is a written document, which frankly you can do at scale in a much more efficient way, right? And the mechanization of this actually becomes really important because now what I'm doing is I'm evaluating that feedback, But I also want to break that process apart, right? I want to tease that thing out into its individual components to be, again, at these points of inference along the way. So yes, I could just have grade one time. That's what I mean by you can do this without the mechanization. So what we talked about with the approach of doing the self-assessment, I can do that, right? And I'm just grading a document now. But what I really want is I want that student to be engaged more in that process. So what we'll do is, because this is a problem, right? So we have this assignment built up this way. What we'll do now in kind of that first point is we'll bring in a feedback point where a peer provides feedback on that first draft, right? Then that student has to reflect on that peer feedback. Then they have to incorporate that peer feedback before they deliver a final document, right? The final document is richer, it's more complete, it's more meaningful, and they've had more bites out of the apple, so to speak. The mechanization provides you an opportunity to be there at that point of inference in their process with these different elements from the platform to be present when that student is making some decisions about their feedback. You
Hmm.
can't do that unless you've got something that's involved in the process with them.
Yeah. But then it kind of raises another point that people could be concerned about is, well, what if students don't give good feedbacks to their peers or give good feedback
Yeah.
to themselves? How are they going to learn?
Yeah. So, we always have that question, right, around the feedback quality. What I view this one as a little bit is, and I think I think this is a universal experience. When you're doing something and you're just cruising along, right? And I've used this example with Cole explaining this assignment. If there's a policeman at the stoplight, you come to a complete stop, right? If there's nobody there, you kind of do the rolling through the thing, right? The mere fact that someone is checking is another bite of that knowledge apple for me, right? Another opportunity for that student to consume that information. So the fact that they know that, hey, you know what? Here's the writing coach, right? Here are the things that we're looking for in this assignment. The student can check those things off, right? In the end, I really want them to do a quality job. I'm okay, like defending the fact that all of my students got A's. I'm okay with defending that. If that were the case and everybody delivered a great job, my grading task is a much simpler thing if everyone's delivered a high quality output. It's also a lot more enjoyable to do my job. The classroom experiences are better, the outputs are experienced, the students are happier. So why does it need to be a mystery? I think we just need to expose what the expectations are. And if the student meets the expectation, then a success has been, we've achieved a success. So in my view, the things like, what is it that I'm really looking for when you're getting ready to submit? Or the fact that I'm going to be giving feedback to my peer, and I don't believe in anonymous feedback. I think you tell them who they are. And I like the idea of the student having to defend their input, because if they don't do a quality job, there is a peer complaint, if you will, right? Associated with that. And if it's an in-person class, there may be actually a confrontation around, hey, I'm looking for your help. Many of you probably have had the experience of where you assign a peer review and a student doesn't get feedback because somebody just blows off the assignment and they feel cheated. Well, I think you want to have that kind of tension, right? Of wanting to do a good job for your peer. And the idea that that feedback is part of their final deliverable that they get judged on or graded upon, evaluated on, I think raises the importance of that piece of feedback as well. So instead of it being, oh, well, here's some feedback, right? And it doesn't really matter. I want to grade that feedback. I want to make sure that student understands that feedback's important, that it's being used in an actual deliverable. And I want that kind of interest and importance to be raised to a point of cognition for everyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a good way to bring that accountability into
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
But let's take a look at how you've actually implemented this into your course. So talk us through a little
sure.
bit, kind of the learning journey involved in this assignment.
Yeah. So the first thing you would do is, and in this particular one, what we had was the case was I had the students selling Microsoft Copilot to the University of South Florida, right? Tough sale, right? It's a very complex environment with a tool that is difficult to understand the value proposition for, right? You're talking about productivity and time savings for people that are fixed costs. right? So very hard to kind of come up with value propositions for that. But had a great class, and they actually they're like, give us a tough one, Dr. Hammond. And I'm like, okay, all right, I'll give you a tough one. So I know this is, I actually spent some time at Microsoft. I know this scenario and this particular sales experience. So I wrote the case based upon the scenario that we had. And the idea, again, was selling Copilot for Office to the University of South Florida. So we had actually been doing a pilot of that, or actually we use Microsoft Copilot for Enterprise at USF. We're a big Microsoft shop. So they also had some practical understanding about what that tool was because they could use it on their desktops. So then the first part of that is that they turn in their self-assessment, right? They submit that to the assignment. From there, that goes, and that has a rubric associated with it, right? Where what the expectations were of what they were supposed to fill out. And they know what that, both how they're giving themselves feedback and what the expectations were for that self-assessment. So their feedback is, how well did you do on the approach, the needs analysis, the problem, product presentation, objection handling, communications, things like that. That's how they're giving themselves feedback. Their self-assessment, however, included the rubric with numbers assigned, right, of how they did on everything, and then also the timestamps, the examples, and then the recommendations for improvement for every one of those sections as well, right? So there's two pieces of feedback there. One is their feedback for themselves, and then the rubric for evaluating their self-assessment, right? So two elements, and that's a little bit confusing. So hear that part. The next part of it then was the peers provided feedback, right? So everybody, was automatically assigned the piece of feedback or assigned their person. And then those people provided feedback on that assignment to those students. Then the originators had to reflect on that activity, right? They had to actually read that content, and then they had to vote or give a score against the value of that feedback. My goal here wasn't necessarily that I wanted them to do a bunch of work on the feedback, but I wanted them to read the feedback and then have some action associated with it they could do very quickly, but at least some bar. Like I have a friend that always says no standards isn't this, or low standards isn't the same as no standards, right? So there's an option here for them, again, with just clicking the boxes to acknowledge that they've looked at it and they scored it in some way. So other than just saying, clicking the box, yes, I read it, now you've got some tacit approval level of recognizing it was something that they had done.
So,
And then
so
the
you
final part
you
of that
attribute,
is,
oh,
I'm sorry,
sorry. So you
go ahead.
attributed them part of their grade for actually going in and reading the feedback that
Yep.
they've received, and then
Yep.
giving some feedback on that feedback that
Right.
they've
Right.
gotten.
So kind of an inception moment, right? Like the students were laughing at the class one day. They're like, so what we're saying is that I'm reflecting on my self-assessment of my feedback to myself from someone else giving me feedback. Like, yes, that's right. Okay. On
Awesome.
the next one.
Yeah, so what we've done, kind of as part of the presentation today, is that Rob has been so kind to actually share each of these activities and also his rubric that he uses to assess students on their self-reflection with our learning design community. So these are actually live on the community now. You can find them on our website where you can download them as a PDF, or you can actually use these templates directly in FeedbackFruits. So from our website, there's a link that will take you to FeedbackFruits where you can apply this inside of your LMS, or if you just already launch FeedbackFruits inside of your LMS and go to the learning design community, you will see these templates live there. So if this feedback inception style of facilitating an assignment is something that you would like to apply either to your own course or share with other faculty at your institution, this is something that we have available, and it's here for free, so that y'all can go and use this for yourself. Any tips for anyone who would be thinking about implementing these into their course, Rob?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to do is kind of the point we had at the start, or like process over output. Like where did that come from? So the premise of that is then why we started with this conversation around AI. I want to put this as the fine point on this, is that I don't believe it's adequate any longer to use a monolithic assignment and judge that the output that somehow or another that the student learned or skills were developed because they were able to deliver an output. Output is available to everybody now. If you think of the distribution of students that we used to have as a normal curve, decide where you want to draw the line, whether it's at 90% or 50% or whatever, but that bottom half of the curve has now moved up to the minimum value of what's delivered by the AI, like the minimum quality output of the AI. So whether I'm writing an email or I'm doing a market evaluation or I'm doing some kind of a case analysis for a public health issue, whatever it is, that is obtainable to everyone. So what we used to be able to do as faculty would be, oh, well, give me a 20-page paper, and I would know that you had to have gone down the wrong path enough times to have had some critical learning, some epiphanies along the way, that skills were developed in the process. That is no longer a valid assumption in today's world, right? And it doesn't matter about the modality. That's one of the things I loved about your chart that you had up earlier, Call, right? It's like whether you want to talk about voice or presentation even, or recording, or it's all very attainable, and the level is way past average. Like it's a good solid third draft kind of output. And my own epiphany moment was actually doing one of these for a role play about 3 years ago. I used ChatGPT to create a press release. I've written dozens of press releases in my life, maybe hundreds. And at that point, the tool delivered a really solid third version draft by itself with just me giving it a prompt. And that really says that then at that moment that, hey, this is no longer an adequate pedagogy. We've got to do something different. My belief set is that feedback is that function to be able to engage in, or I should say, engaging in the process is the way you do that. Feedback is the mechanism that you provide at engaging in that process as you're looking at each one of these internal development or deliverables. And then you come back at the end point then with delivering by using a tool to mechanize it. Because when you do this, you end up with 3 or 4 times the number of assignments that you would have if you had just the output. And again, that creates burden for faculty that you just can't ignore. So providing some way to do this at scale, yes, you can build these assignments. So first off, you got to engage in process. You can no longer engage on this one-time monolithic projects. That's point one. Point two is feedback is critical in that engagement process in order to build scale and to have relevance at those points so that there's a meaning to each one of those outputs and the students connect the process elements to the output and goal. So that's really important. And then the third part then is, how do you mechanize that process so you can operate at scale? If you're working at a small university or you're teaching at a university where maybe you have 10 students or maybe 8 or 12 or 15 or something like that, then there's a lot of options available to you. If you're at a large state university like I am, and we've got 40, 50 students in a course, you got to find ways to mechanize that process.
Yeah, exactly. And on the slide here is just a few points, kind of more from the literature, from the theoretical side around what are the ways that you can use feedback as this guiding force. And I know we talked earlier, Rob, just about the challenge of how do you make sure that students are giving good feedback and being critical on it. And one of the ways that you kind of implemented another one of these speed bumps of making sure that students are aware of what's the expectation was actually making them go through this checklist in FeedbackFruits before they made their submissions on their feedback of some of the guidance that you wanted to give them. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that guidance?
Yeah, that's a good example of that police car at the stop sign, right? It's like, if they could ignore all this, right? They didn't have to demonstrate that they had accomplished these, but it was that last checkpoint before you submit it. Hey, did you? And what I did to build this list was I took all the assignments that people had used and or I taught the course multiple times before and said, okay, what are the things they always forget to do? Right. And just built my checklist from those things that they would always forget to do. So timestamps for each item, right? Okay, they don't have to put them in there, but it's going to be a deduction if they don't. So check, I've got that. So if the student goes through and checks all those pieces off, it should be a good assignment, right? It should be maybe not, it may not be an A, but if it doesn't have these things, then the student is accepting and acknowledging the fact that they're delivering work that is not ready for an A.
Exactly. And it's just another one of those ways that you can build in those speed bumps and something that's kind of through the technology, through the learning activities and FeedbackFruits, that we can very easily add those speed bumps and put, again, students in the driver's seat to control their own understanding of what the expectations are and how well they're going to perform on their assignments. One of the other things that we also do is trying to guide students with this just-in-time feedback. So of course, we talk a lot about how students are using AI, but we also want to use AI as a way to help students throughout their learning process. So one thing that we have within FeedbackFruits and peer review and the group evaluations and really any of the feedback tools is our feedback coach. So as the student is going and writing feedback, be that a self-assessment or be that feedback to a peer, we are actually able to analyze that feedback and then guide them on, well, is this comprehensive? Is this actually meaningful and quality feedback? And then giving them that real-time guidance of how they could actually improve or change or make that feedback better. So just again, another one of those speed bumps, another one of those ways to bring the awareness to the student of why this is important and then guiding them through how they can actually improve just in time.
I
So,
think it's a
well,
great point, Cole, because
yeah.
one of the things I think that's out there, and I actually heard this on a higher ed podcast. So no credit for me. It was an educator out of Australia, I think, that was talking about is was basically making the call and the challenge that as educators, we have to move from trying to catch people using AI and punish them for it to using AI to ensure that learning occurred. And so I think that's a great way to think about where this tool enhances the learning experience. When you've got students that are busy, they're working, they've got a big social life, they got a lot going on. How do we, be that police car, if you will, right? That model of you're present, you're there at that moment where they're engaging with your content to be available for them. And I think AI is a really exciting development for us to be able to be much more present, much more engaged, much more available
Yeah,
um, at that moment when they're making decisions about their assignments or where learning's occurring.
exactly. Be it on the weekends, be it at odd hours,
Whenever it is. It
something can be
certainly is
there.
not going to be when you're working, probably.
Yep,
They're
exactly.
students.
Guys, well, it brings us into the last 5 minutes of our webinar and our final poll of the day before we just share kind of our 4 key takeaways from the presentation. So for our final poll, just looking at kind of based on what you've seen today or what you knew already, what do you think is some of the biggest challenges in focusing on evaluating the learning process rather than just the final product? And then again, if anybody else does have any questions they'd like to ask, please already start to throw them in the chat and we'll use our last few minutes with Rob to talk about them. Rob, in the chat, we had a question from Karith about, well, how do you see that students respond to these speed bumps and constant surveillance while they write? Are they responding positively or do you get any pushback?
Generally speaking, my the firsthand feedback when I've asked students about this particular experience, because I wondered, they liked it because they know now what is expected. So instead of I've got this assignment that's maybe not worded great, it made sense to me, right? But now they're getting feedback while they're doing it, and you do run the risk that their expectation is if they met the standard that's in the document, like that's provided by the AI, then they think that they're going to get that grade, right? So you got to be really careful that you do deliver on that expectation, that if they do what you said, you got to give them the grade that's associated with that, or they'll feel like, you cheated them or that they were misled in the process. So if you position it the right way, that, hey, it's a tool, it's available to you. I've kind of taught this AI. They know what AI is now. Like they're all using it. So it's not some foreign like surveillance thing to them. And I don't think they perceive it as surveillance. They know they're doing an assignment and they're just getting feedback before they press submit. And so I think there are multiple students that found that to be really valuable. And frankly, if the student doesn't care, they just go click, 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 submit. What are they?
Exactly.
Didn't really hurt them.
Exactly. No, good to see that the responsives are generally positive though.
Yeah.
In response to our poll, we're still seeing that one of the biggest challenges seen is time constraints and of course workload for instructors. So hopefully through some of the different approaches that we've shared today, that you see some different avenues or different ways to approach implementing a process-based assessment that can help and not be too cumbersome on teachers. Coming in second place, kind of lack of effective tools. So if FeedbackFruits is not something that you already have, a potential answer there. But I want to move it just in our last minute to the key takeaways. So in case if you zoned out or weren't able to join us for the whole presentation, here are kind of four things that might be worthwhile remembering or taking away with you. The whole focus of this presentation was about how we can look at the learning process rather than just the deliverables of students, and breaking assignments into smaller stages, having check-ins to evaluate thinking, and using feedback specifically as a way to actually guide and drive this learning process, kind of being just the main two takeaways from what we've gone through today. Of course, doing this at scale is where the challenge really starts to become. So using peer-driven feedback, focusing on self-assessment by students being a way that you can help to increase that feedback quality, increase the amount of feedback, and make sure that it's something that works at scale. And ultimately, all of this we do with the goal to help students build these skills that AI can't replace, these durable skills that they're going to take away with them into their future careers. You have any last bookend you want to put on our presentation today, Rob?
No, I think that covers it. And best of luck to everybody. It's a journey, and I hope, all boats rise with the tide. So thanks for the opportunity to share. And you guys can always find me at the University of South Florida or catch me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, feel free to throw your LinkedIn in the chat as well for people that want to connect. We have all the resources that we shared throughout the presentation today. You'll get the recording, you'll get the links to those resources before the end of the week for anybody that wants to continue going in further. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. We hope to see you at one of our next events or presentations. So thank you, everybody, and hope to see you soon. Thanks for being here to share, Rob.
All right, you bet. Thank you. Bye-bye.